welcome to Lard TV, where I'm in the studio taking the role of Sydney Roundwood, who, due to medical science and the fight against COVID, is on special duties elsewhere. So, David, I do apologise that you're not being interviewed by Sydney, but you've got me instead. I wanted to have a chat with you about O Group, because we've got a set of rules that are just with the printer now. With our sister company Riser Express and World War II. Let's talk about you and World War II, Dave. You're getting fairly old now, but you're not old enough to have actually been there. So tell me, how long have you actually been World War II wargaming?
Yeah, thanks. I'm not that old. But I think it first started, obviously, so many other people, with airfix soldiers, and what were they, HOOO scale, preferred scale, and wargaming proper probably started, I think, with those set of rules. I think they're called Operation Warboard.
I remember them. A very attractive little book format, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's it. And it's all about where you had to have a rather interesting, I think it was a machine gun template, etc., etc. And those were a pretty, for their time and place, I think those were a pretty good set of rules. So it started with Operation Warboard before moving on. I think I was caught up in the squad leader excitement when it came out. A bit of squad lead, obviously that I think faded somewhat many years later with the introduction of advanced squad leader, where probably World War II at that point took a little bit of a back step to Napoleonics, but I continually kept dabbling in World War II right up until obviously we come to the present day with O Group.
Okay, so as we know, and as you've alluded to, World War II wargaming has seen many shapes and forms over the years, with rule sets of all types and sizes and degrees of success. So tell us, David, the big question, I guess, why does the world need a new set of World War II rules? It's a harsh question, I know, but let's ask it anyway. I'm not going to do a Sydney and give you a comfy ride. We're going to go straight in with the boot.
Yeah, that's very obvious. You're not quite as, how shall I say, soft and gentle as Sydney.
No, that's right.
But it is a good question, because there are quite a few World War II rule sets out there. But it began about, I should think, maybe three and a bit years ago, when I was playing a large game with numerous players, where we were creating the Battle of Arnhem. And I had command of one of the parachute battalions or brigades, and we were using an old and very well established set of rules, and there was nothing wrong. We had a good game, etc. But it was a 2-day game, and I gradually came to the conclusion that throughout the course of this game, the only actual command decisions I was making was what to fire and at what target. And I rarely had any other decision making. So what I decided to do was, perhaps in a similar vein to Pickett's Charge, ACW rules and General D'Arby Napoleonics, was to ask myself, what orders or command decisions would a World War II colonel actually make? And so off I went to do some research, checking away on all the various reading lists that I have. But the real gems probably came out when I got hold of the British Army manuals, which I don't know if you've got. I've got the British Army training manual from 1937 and the British Infantry training manual on the infantry battalion from 1944.
Yeah.
And these had the real kind of gems for me hidden inside. And there were significant pages and paragraphs devoted to such things as the battalion commander's plan, the use of reserves. In fact, reserves are touched on time and time again in the earlier manual, and of course control. So this led me to in a direction where I wanted to develop a set of rules where the wargamer would make a plan, or have a plan, and I'm not necessarily talking about a huge, 20-sided plan in A4, in triplicate, but just a simple plan, perhaps as simple as just saying A company are on the right, B company on the left, and I'll keep C in reserve, and the tanks will be with A company, or whatever, but a plan nonetheless. And then, of course, I wanted the gamer to be able to consider the deployment of his reserves continually throughout the battle, and also being able to deploy those reserves in such a way that they can actually influence the battle. So I found in many games where I've used reserves, I seem to spend an interminable time trudging up the table to get to the point where they wanted to make the decisive maneuver, and by which time they got there, the enemy had carefully rearranged his defences just to meet them.
I think that's a really good point, and I think what tends to happen in games like that is that people don't allocate forces to reserves. They just push everything up front. So if they're running a battalion, they'll attack with all their companies because they know that holding something in reserve actually means they're never going to play a part in the game.
Yeah.
That's interesting to hear what you're saying, because I think what we've seen over the last 10 or 15 years is that there's been a lot of emphasis on games at sort of skirmish level that have moved towards putting the emphasis on command and control. Historically, when you looked at wargames rules, if we go back 20 years or so, you could tell that whoever was designing the game had thought a lot about movement, thought a lot about firing, but command and control was often an afterthought, because basically it was down to you, the player, to make those command and control decisions. But as you say, so often those decisions were about, where am I moving these troops to, and what am I going to fire at? And that really isn't that's the type of decision that would be being made by a platoon leader, not the battalion leader. So this sounds like an opportunity to put some of those ideas and focus that we've seen in recent years on smaller level games into something that bit larger, and look at a battalion level game. So tell me, David, when, I don't know about you, but when I first set out to design a game, I've kind of got a design brief in my head, even if I've not got it written down, a bit like one of your plans. It's important to have a plan, even if it isn't a whole page of A4. So let's think about that. What would you say were let's say 3 prime design objectives that you wanted to achieve? You can make that 4, or you could make that 2 if you that's all you have. But what were the design objectives?
3 sounds a nice rounded number, so let's stick with that.
Although actually it is an odd number, but we won't challenge your mathematical knowledge. Right.
So so if you 3 main command decisions. First of all is the one I've already touched on.
Yeah. What
I wanted to do in the rules, and for players to be able to do, was to make command decisions in a war game that was similar to those of a battalion colonel and maybe the company command in World War II. Now, obviously, we're talking about a war game, and you can't replicate all the command decisions of a battalion commander even in that period. I mean, even if anyone who's had the distinct displeasure of working in a battalion HQ, brigade or div HQ will know that some of the pressures that they come under. But if I could simply touch on some of that decision making, then that would draw the war game as slightly closer towards the realism or the history of command in World War II as best you can in a war game. And it focuses the player's mind on those decisions, those command decisions, as opposed to continually thinking about, will my Tiger penetrate the T-34 at, whatever, 4,000 yards? It was about making command decisions. So that was kind of the prime objective of the rules.
Okay.
And then during their development, one obviously reads numerous accounts of the fact the World War II battlefield is a pretty empty battlefield, and information on exact enemy dispositions is quite rare and is difficult to acquire, certainly difficult to act on. So therefore it was important to design a war game that had fog of war, hidden movement, infiltration, all these traits of World War II battlefields as a core element. Now, of course, as we all know, in most war games, all the figures are on the table, so the fog of war tends to go out of the window pretty quickly. So in one of the early drafts, we had a discussion about this, and a very erudite war games designer, who shall remain nameless, Clark, reminded me or challenged me to come up with an idea where we could use blinds in a war game without writing anything down.
Yeah.
So you avoid that situation where at the beginning of the game, the war game has got to write, Tiger tanks under blind A, platoon B under blind B, etc., etc. And generally by the end of the game, most of the blinds have gone, and or the opponent knows, well, they must be fake blinds because all the rest of his forces are clearly up.
Yeah, yeah.
So that method was you came up with the use of what we called combat patrols. And these represent your hidden movement, your infiltration, and they also assist in the deployment of your reserves. So by deploying these combat patrols, which are just are basically markers on the war games table that have no combat value as such, we create a battlefield that is empty, but is also full of potential threats and potential enemy positions. Because combat patrols are basically your small teams or scouts going forward and taking up your forward deployment positions for the rest of the platoon to move up onto, or maybe the light gun to move up onto into a new position. So from these combat patrols, the owning player can deploy a platoon or an anti-tank gun or maybe a machine gun. So therefore, the opponent knows that these are potential threats and deployment positions, and therefore has to deal with them. But the one thing about them is he'll never know what will be on a combat patrol, because that's the command decision of the owning player. And also, you can keep deploying them throughout the whole game. So they don't appear at the start and then gradually whittle away as the battle continues. The fog of war is there from the start all the way through to the end of the game, so that players are continually threatening sectors, trying to probe weak areas, exploit flanks in order to deploy their reserves.
So could I deploy a patrol and in fact it not be a threat at all, but it's simply something that the opponent has to respond and react to because there's a potential threat that is heading towards them, or operating in a certain area?
Yes, but basically the opponent will never know what could deploy onto that combat patrol.
Right.
It could be the owning player's intention to do nothing with, say, 2 combat patrols probing up on the far right flank. It could just be distraction attempt, but the opposing player will never know that, and he can't. Well, maybe he does take the risk. Maybe he thinks, I don't think he'll exploit that flank. But he's always under pressure as a player to think it could develop. And if I don't keep an eye on it, I could get caught out.
Right. Okay. Right. Fine.
And
right. Sorry, I interrupted you.
That's
carry
right.
on.
Yeah,
You carry on.
So there's 2. And the final one was, which I think we both kind of have in common, it's to design a game that had both friction and decision points throughout the game. Friction is achieved by the use of dice to determine your available number of orders for the game or for that turn. But what I didn't want was for the gamer to be at the complete mercy of those dice rolls. So, for instance, let's just say you roll a handful of dice or whatever your command roll was, and through no fault of your own, it was complete rubbish. You can do nothing, and then it continues like that. So your game can be somewhat lead to underperformance because of the dice and not the commander. So in this, I've developed a system of what we call battalion headquarters or HQ orders that you can keep from turn to turn. So there's a limited number that you can bank, save, and use when you want to do so. So you can manage the command situation better. Of course, if you use them all, then you have to wait until you've recouped them. But at least you have some ability to manage the command situation and impact upon it, despite friction appearing perhaps, at the beginning and hindering you. And then if we just move on to the final bit about decision points, is that because there's a limited number of orders per turn for the player to use, other than these saved ones, the player's got to prioritize. He's got to consider, where's my Schwerpunkt going to be for this turn? Is it the same as last time? I keep pushing, say, on the right with A company, or do I move over to B company and start pushing forward with B? It's in the manual that the 1937 one, I think, speaks a lot about a commander being in a place where he can best influence the fighting of his units. And that's what we're using our orders to do. It's our commanders influence the fighting of our units. And the player then has to make the decisions that if he uses all of his orders to do stuff in his phase, he may not be able to react to the opponent. And vice versa. If he doesn't do enough in his phase, he might give the initiative completely to the opponent. Because the game isn't completely I go, you go. It basically has a system where it's I go and the opponent can react within a limited environment. But for every action you take, there's a potential reaction from the enemy. So it's a question of those decision points in each game. Where do I use my orders? How do I use my orders? And do I use them all in my phase, or do I save some to respond to the enemy's action in his phase? So it's basically that: command decisions, fog of war, empty battlefield, and lots of decision points about the use of your command influence during the turn.
Okay, sounds really interesting and really fresh. A very fresh approach, which I think is something that we're always keen to see. New and interesting ideas. Obviously, one presumes we're going to be seeing some new and interesting mechanisms to back that up. But I don't want to talk about that today, because as we run through this series of chats, we're going to be backing this up with a series of videos as well, where, Dave, you're going to be creating some videos which are going to be complementary to the conversations that we're having here. And as people are listening to this, they're going to be able to go to Lard TV on YouTube and watch the first part, where you're going to be taking a look at some of the issues that we're discussing here today. And that's going to give us a great opportunity for you to play through a game and specifically focus in, if you like, in a little cameo roles on specific mechanisms, just so people will have an opportunity, rather than watching, you playing an absolute whole game through, which is something we're going to be doing. But this is going to be an opportunity to create some short videos to focus in on some very specific aspects of the rules. So we can introduce those concepts to people. And obviously people are going to be able to ask questions and come back to us. And as we move forward, hopefully, towards the end of lockdown, we're going to be running some games on Lard TV, which I think is going to be fun. And one of the things that we've been discussing as well is the opportunity maybe for you and I to try it on over a Zoom game, and then see how we can do that and maybe create some ideas there. But there we go. We will adapt and survive, as somebody once cleverly said. But let's talk about size, Dave, because it does matter. We'll talk about the size of forces. Typically, what would be the size of force in historical terms that I would be commanding on a battlefield or any other gamer playing O group? What's a typical force?
So your size of the force in O group, it's labelled as a battalion level game, which means a player will field your war games equivalent of a battalion on the tabletop.
Right.
And that battalion is then in turn made up of several companies. So you'll have the HQ company and generally 3 infantry companies. And each infantry company is then in turn made up of normally 3 platoons, each led by the company commander.
Okay.
And
now
those
that's obviously a pretty classic triangular setup. And if we've got a more old-fashioned square division with 4 companies or 4 sections per platoon, that can we do that? Or
it's quite possible that a square setup is fine. You could have 4 companies, or you could have one of the normally earlier war ones where the platoon was made up of 4 sections, whatever. You can deploy those.
Right. Okay, fine. So you can actually tailor the rules specifically to historical Orbats. So if for example, I'm just working on a pint-sized campaign for Chain of Command at the moment, where I'm looking at 1940, and if I were to say, right, I want to take a historical Orbat, I could replicate that faithfully using O group, I take it.
Yeah, that's it. We've got special rules to cover 4 section platoons,
right.
Or even 2 occasionally. I think some of the American paratroopers and rangers went down to 2 section platoons.
Yeah.
So there's rules to cover both of those.
Brilliant.
And obviously, if your battalion is 4 companies, then that's pretty straightforward. You just simply add a 4th company, and you can decide whether to deploy, as you probably would, 2 up, 2 back in reserve.
Okay, so typically, though, as we've discussed, you've got your battalion, and what sort of supports would I be seeing operating alongside that in a typical game? I don't know how it works. You tell me. Yeah,
you can have any supports that you want in that's relevant to your particular scenario. So the battalion organisation tables at the back, it covers the big 4 initially.
Yeah.
And then you've got access to your either battalion or regimental supports. So if you were the British, that could be things like your carrier platoon, the anti-tank gun platoon, your sappers, etc. And then you can move up to selecting divisional level supports, which would include tanks, reconnaissance vehicles, artillery, sort of onboard direct fire artillery, or engineering vehicles, etc. So basically, players can either choose the supports to match a particular historical scenario, or they can just use a point system, agree on a set number of points, and then just purchase their supports according to the points list.
Okay, so it's historical, but there is a system for just me saying to you, let's play X number of points on Wednesday night, and I'll choose my forces and you choose yours.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Okay, good. Right, well, so we know what size force we're fielding historically, but what about scale? What sort of figure scale do we use? How many figures are we talking about in terms of a typical force? And how are we going to base? Because you say to people a battalion level force, and they think, blimey, that's going to be a lot of figures, because I'm used to playing a platoon, so it's going to be billions of figures. Is that the case? I presume not. Being
no, it's not. I've deliberately gone scale agnostic for the infantry section, which is your basic building block.
Yeah.
And I've simply gone a base represents a section. So it doesn't matter how many figures you have on that base. It could be 1 figure. If you're perhaps a 6mm gamer, it could be 10 figures, almost 1-to-1.
Yeah.
What matters is the fact that there are 3 sections of your platoon.
Yeah.
Or 4 if you're using an earlier variant. But it's that the platoon is then made up of those 3 bases. artillery and tanks, they're a bit different along with support weapons. They are on a scale that's roughly 1 to 2. So
Okay.
if you field a tank section, it's roughly 2 tanks.
Right.
And then you can just build up from there. So if you look at it in its simplest form, it's 3 bases to a platoon. That will be 10 bases to a company, because we have a base for the company commander, and so 30 bases to a battalion. So a battalion in its essence is 30 bases, and then you can just, if you want, add on tanks, anti-tank guns, maybe the HQ, which doesn't have to be on table, but some people like it like that. So the minimum you're going to get away with it, you could do it with 30 bases.
Okay, right, fine. Well, I you know, looking at this, I've been using 10mm, 12mm figures, call them what you will, and I've gone for about 3 figures to a section. So 9 figures, and you've got a whole platoon. So 27 figures plus the HQ, you know, another 4 or so figures for that. 30 figures gives me a whole company. So it's not beyond the wit of man or woman to be able to create that type of force, maybe from the type of force they've got. I mean, I'll give you an example. One of the things I've been looking at in 15mm is my I Ain't Been Shot Man forces, and they pretty much equate, the company in I Ain't Been Shot Man equates to a battalion in O group. So that would be a really easy transition for anybody playing that rule set. So basing, what's the plan on basing? Do you have a set base sizes or what?
Oh no, so fairly simple. There's no set base size. You can, your section, if it's an infantry section, base, it can be on whatever size you like. Right. So as long as you make some allowances, perhaps if your opponent's bases are slightly different, you can make an allowance where necessary, but generally it doesn't matter. If you've got big bases, quite large bases, I know a lot of people will clearly have their infantry perhaps on the some large bases that are commercially available. Well, they're perfectly acceptable. Just keep them in base-to-base contact, where if you have smaller bases, you can spread them out a bit to reflect the same sort of frontage. So no, the only advice given on basing is that you can recognise what the troops are. So if you've got anti-tank section, it'd be handy to be able to know at a reasonable glance what that is, or an anti-tank rifle, etc., etc. But otherwise, basing's what you want it to be.
Okay, which is always practical. And clearly, when you're talking about a section as a base, sections, I presume, you're not activating sections individually and operate and then running it all over the table on their own. Otherwise, it would be a game with many component parts. How do sections operate as what, part of a platoon, or how does that work?
Yeah, infantry. Your basic infantry platoon is your tactical unit. Right. So your individual infantry sections that constitute that platoon stick together and they operate as a platoon. You can, of course, if you wish, deploy additional support weapons such as an anti-tank section or a SF medium machine gun or something as a lone section. You can do that, or you can attach them to the infantry platoons. Of course, the only downside of deploying everything, your support sections individually as a single section, is that's difficult to command and control. So you kind of pays your money, you takes choice.
Right, but I could attach them to an infantry platoon. And
yes, you could.
And move as part of that, right? Okay, fine. So effectively, within a company, you've got 3 tactical units, which are platoons, and so within a battalion, you know, your basic infantry, you've got about 9 tactical units, and then plus support. So we're heading around that 12 to 15 units typically in a game, which they say is the sweet spot. So that's ticking the boxes there. Now tell me about a ground scale, David, because if I'm going to set up a battlefield, one of the things that I've talked about before, both to you and, you know, on the Oddcast and elsewhere, is the fact that I'm very keen to replicate some battles from the Normandy
Yeah, yeah.
particularly things like Operation Epsom, which is an operation that has always intrigued me. So if I want to set that up, I've got a big collection of 1 to 25,000 maps from the period. If I want to set that up, what sort of ground scale am I looking at on the table?
I've split the game into two rough scales for ranges, etc., on the table. And the main one concentrates for your 10, 12 to 15 millimeter figures.
Yeah.
That is very roughly 1 inch represents 25 yards on the ground. So if you're playing on an average size 6x4 table, then your battle area is getting on for 2,000 yards by just over 1,000 yards deep. Obviously, the deeper the table, kind of the better if you're replicating historical scenarios, or indeed you can choose, I think as many people do, is simply play up the length of the table to give you that increased depth.
That's interesting. I tend to find myself doing that more and more because it does give that depth. And in terms of a game where reserves are important, having a slightly deeper table so you can potentially have a first objective line and then a second objective line is always interesting. So, I mean, we won't rely on your mathematics, but according to my incredibly sharp brain, that gives us a width, if we're playing across a 4-foot frontage, of about 1,200 yards, which is ample. You know, you could get 2 battalions attacking down that table, couldn't you? Which leads me to a question that if I wanted to have a game with maybe 2 battalions on one side, can I do that? Do the rules scale up?
Yeah, there's an entire chapter / section devoted under the title of battle groups, which is basically a generic term for British Army brigade. So you can deploy 2 battalions side by side, or maybe even 3 battalions, or perhaps the players could decide to have 2 infantry battalions supported by maybe a tank battalion, and they all come under the single command of a battle group commander, which is generally played by one player, and he will organize his battalion, set the mission, set the objectives, be in command of the artillery assets and obviously the central reserves. And then basically the battalions will fight off against the respective opposition on the other side of the table. So 2 or 3 battalion games are quite possible.
Does it slow the game down, being serious? Because I mean, you know, let me give you an example. When we play sharp practice, where the cards are in the deck and units are activated in sequence, you know, the bigger the game, the more units, the slower things can tend to get. Whereas if we play big chain of command, where if we've got several players on one side, they can all have their own command dice, and therefore things still clip along at a pace. And from from my experiences, there is a section of command dice. If we were upscaling to play the battle group option, I presume everybody would get their own command dice, and therefore things would move along at the pace.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So each commander of a battalion gets his own dice. So once he's had his mission from the battle group commander, and once the command phase happens, then each player can crack on and do what he wants. Obviously, the larger any formation is, you always get a little bit of friction, and the only friction would probably come into that would be in your classic war game, of where you have to wait for the other person to finish. But no,
which is an issue which is applicable to every single rule set on the planet. So.
Yes, absolutely. So if you have some quick players and slow players, there's always going to be that time difference. But otherwise, both players, they all get their own command dice. They all roll them. They all do what they want in their time.
Right. Now, one thing I just want to focus on is that the game system represents buildings and built-up areas as precisely that, as a built-up area. It's not really a case of replicating every individual house, every meandering lane through the backwaters of different villages. You've got a system of built-up areas. Can you tell us a bit about that, because I think when it comes to creating the battlefield, a wood is a wood, a field is a field, a road is a road, but built-up areas are very specific to the rules, and that's one of the mechanisms that's impressed me as something that allows things to be appropriate. You're not thinking, what window am I firing the Panzerfaust out of, are you?
Yeah, that's correct. The built-up area is very much considered a sector. So you're looking at a small group of buildings, maybe a section of a street, etc., etc., or a single but complete farm.
Yeah.
And you allocate a platoon to garrison or defend that built-up area section.
Right.
And then it's down to the player to group his platoon or any attached weapons and the appropriate fire arcs, oddly enough, exactly as your company commander would do, and then be given an objective to hold it. So it doesn't really matter where the actual war games figures are placed, as long as they're pointing in the relevant fire arc. That's your built-up area. So you don't, exactly as you say, you don't need to worry about, well, does this building doesn't have a doorway, so I can't fire? There's no windows here, so I can't get in. It is just treated as a small section of buildings of which it's deemed the infantry are in or around that area.
Right. Okay. So, and when you talk about the arc of fire, presumably you're talking about the face. For example, a square built-up area will have 4 faces, and it's which one they're placed to fire out of is the important factor. It's not, are you in the bedroom or the bathroom? The important thing is you're facing west or north or east or whatever. Right.
Yes, correct. That's you're given your fire direction, and that's it. So yes, it's the facing.
Okay, so we've talked about the size of the force. We've talked about how we represent that on a battlefield. We've talked about how we're representing terrain. What else do people need if they're going to play the game? Presumably dice. What else?
Well, yes, you do need some dice. Normal 6-sided dice, you'll be very pleased to hear.
I will, because any other dice are an act of the devil, basically. But yeah.
Yeah, I've gone deliberately designed it with the most. What are the dice that most war gamers have? Well, most of us have got 6-sided dice, so let's use those. Obviously, they do bring in some, when you're trying to do probability, some interesting mathematical equations, but that was all dealt with by my son, who's doing a maths degree, so I was all right on that front.
Right, yes, child labour, eh? Right, we'll have you up in court, but yeah, okay.
He's an adult now, it doesn't count. So, about 10 6-sided dice, that's all you need for the basics, and you do need a few markers, which I believe are going to be produced via two fat lardies.
Yeah, I have in my hand a set of markers. So yes, we've got them ready. They're all being produced, and they'll be with us in plenty of time for our release date, which we'll talk about in a minute. But
yes, okay, very exciting.
Yeah.
So these markers they denote shock, which is the morale level of your platoon or section, and there's only 3 morale levels, so it's basically 1 shot, 2 shot, 3 shot. That's your lot. So that's fairly simple and can be done with 1 token. And you can either use the tokens you've got there, or you could use mini dice or casualty figures, whatever you like.
Yeah. And
then you just need literally a handful of other tokens to denote special events. So that could be a hesitant company that's suffering a bit of a command and control crisis, or maybe battalion mortars have gone low on ammo and there's just a marker needed just to denote that for the turn, or however long it's out of ammo. So,
and we've got the lovely order chits as well, haven't we? Because when you've got a handful of orders that you can spend in the turn, it's nice to have a physical embodiment of that, and then you can place them on the table as you use them, which shows us which units have been activated, which helps in that situation where one side is able to respond and react to the other.
Yes, it does. So it gives clear indication of what unit is undertaking a reaction, so therefore what you can react to. They also help with the fact that you can see, as you use your orders, your pile is shrinking. Sometimes it's going down a lot quicker than you'd like. Anyway, let's not go there.
No, let's avoid shrinking piles. Right.
So
Good.
the only other thing you're going to need is, I've mentioned before, is a plan.
Oh,
Either in your head or just jotted down. It doesn't matter. Generally, in your head is easiest. A
yeah.
plan. Have a plan. You'll probably be all right.
To fail to plan is to plan to fail, David.
Correct.
Yeah,
Yeah. Prior
absolutely.
planning prevents blah blah blah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Okay, so once the players have decided upon their scenario, um, how do they do it? So I want to play Epsom. How do I go about setting myself up? Because I know I've got my forces, so
Yep.
I know the units. I know how to represent them on the table. I know how to get my terrain. I know I've got my dice ready. I've got my tape inches, I presume. Tape measure.
Oh yes, of course.
Yeah,
Yes, inches.
absolutely. Good.
Yes.
Okay. And how would I now go about setting up a scenario?
Yeah, so you can choose the two, I think they're fairly war game standard methods. You can either go for a historical scenario based on an actual battle or engagement, um, outlining how maybe the attacker came in or the defender deploys, and you can just set them up as they were historically. Or you can adopt the basic attack defense scenario in the game, in which you will set yourself a number of objectives to hold. If you're the defender, if you're the attacker, you can set yourself a number of objectives or phase lines to take, which will indicate that you've won the game. Or you can there is a mechanism in the game for defeating a battalion through attrition. So you could just simply choose which method to go for. And if you go for the game attacker defending setup, then there are deployment roles that allow you to deploy various units at the start, and then you go from there.
Okay, well, what I'd like to do is leave some of those specific mechanisms for the other programs in this series, because I think it would be a great idea to be able to examine how the mechanisms work in practice, and do so in detail rather than just chatting over them and doing so superficially. I'd also like to set you a bit of a challenge for this series, David. I'd like you to take a look for each of the videos we produce and show me something different that you've created within the rules that's gonna make it a bit more interesting. So maybe a unique game mechanism, or just some interesting new ideas. So we're going to be having a look at that as we go forward, in terms of being able to see what we're doing. I think the next game that the next program that we're going to be looking at how you set about putting together your plans and setting your objectives. And we're going to be looking at how the game is then actually physically set up on the table, how you go about deploying your forces, and how the use of patrols can influence the game, because I think that's going to be a nice little shoebox full of information that we're going to be able to process in one go. So yeah, that's where I'd like to start out for the first of the practical application programs in this series. Now, talking of practical application, we're often asked about the release date on sets of rules. In fact, as soon as we say we're play testing something, people go, "When's it being released?" And of course, it's I've often said this, but it's an organic process of development, if you like. It's not a mechanical process, it's a creative process. So we kind of never know how long the journey is, even when we've embarked upon it. But now I think we can tell people that we are due for release on the 1st of March, because as we record this, the printer's proofs are ready for me to go and pick up, and I'm going to be heading over and doing that. So when you are listening to this video, you'll be able to, you'll be able to cut us off at any point that you get bored and go along to the Too Fat Lardy's website, click on the Rise of Its Press section, and you'll be able to purchase the rules in an advanced order format, which is going to include a free PDF of the rules, but also hard copy of the rules and opportunity to buy the game tokens as well at a fabulous price. So I'd like to thank Dave for coming along and joining us today. And we're going to look forward to the next show, which we're going to be running in a few days' time. And over the next few weeks, we're going to have an opportunity to get a real chance to see how the game works, and then hopefully see a whole game being played out. So thanks again to Dave for joining us, and thank you to you for listening. Thanks very much. Good night.